Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Sorry about that slightly protracted screen sharing process. Um, so, yeah, what I'm going to share with you today is a presentation based on the photographic exhibition, which I began organizing over a year ago during the lockdowns of COVID, when I, like everybody else, had more time on my hands than I knew what to do with. And I decided then that I would not only try and do something with the large box of notebooks and journals that I'd been lugging around for almost 40 years. But I would also do something with the photographs that I took during the Argentine occupation from April to June 1982. And for that, of course, the book was fine because I went to my usual publishers, Pen and Sword, and they agreed to publish a Falkland Islanders wartime journal. Didn't like the title they gave it much, but they said things need to do what they say on the can in the publishing world, so that's fine. And but the photographs were a different matter because they had, as I say, been following me around for 40 years. And at one stage, the large box of them had been acting as a doorstop in a flat. And some of them had actually been chewed by a dog. So I had to get these restored. And for that, I went cap in hand to the Friends of the Falkland Islands Museum and National Archives in Stanley, and they very kindly agreed. They very kindly agreed to fund this. So there we are. Sorry about the interference from the noise there. So the primary objective was to create an exhibition in the 40th anniversary year in Stanley at the museum. And this went very well, almost a little over a year ago now. I think it was February the 8th or 9th. We put all of these beautifully restored prints on the wall in their exhibition area, and it was open to the public. And it was really the first event of the 40th anniversary year. I found that obviously very pleasing because this was my personal photographic record, and to see it on show there was very pleasing. It was as if the photos had come home, really. Subsequently, we took the show to the Chatham Historic Dockyard Museum, not far from London. And it ran for about 6 weeks there, and I launched the book there as well. Kim, I assume that you would somehow tell me if I wasn't coming through clearly. I can't hear anything, I don't think.
Yeah,
but
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. So I thought originally about calling it simply 40 at 40, riffing on the idea of 40 years and 40 photographs. And I did indeed put together the 40 best photographs from all of those which had survived. But they hadn't all survived, and I fear that some of the best ones had been lost when the Argentines raided the dark room that I shared with my friend Peter King. Others were provided to magazine and newspaper publishers after the war, and I never saw them again. Not even sure if I saw any payment, but anyway. And so I was left to deal with the surviving ones. Some of them had survived reasonably well as prints, although, as I say, never mind being dog-eared, some were actually slightly dog-chewed. And others I had as no more than black and white film strips because I had made a stupid mistake in the darkroom, and I managed to print them with almost no contrast. But I fortunately never threw away the strips because I thought that they were potentially important. And when I started working with the photographic restorer, Alex Schneiderman, he looked at them and he said, this is interesting because unlike digital photography, with old-fashioned black and white photography, the information is always there. Even if the negatives look very bland without much contrast, we can do something with them. And indeed, he did that. And I'll mention to you the ones that I'd written off and that he brought back to life. But those photographs I had never in 40 years actually seen as prints. So when they came up on the screen, that was the first time I'd really seen them in 40 years. So the collection here, the exhibition, stretches from the early hours of the 2nd of April through 12 possibly 14 or 15 months. The first part, as you can see here, starts with the invasion on the 2nd of April. And then we segue into the days after the conflict, and then even go into some aspects of official visits and reconstruction and so on. So this photo was taken from the front door of the Upland Goose on the 2nd of April, roughly, I think about 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. Government House had effectively just fallen. There was a tense sort of ceasefire, and these troops, much less the specialized special forces, but more the conscript troops, were pouring into Stanley, going up Ross Road with Victory Green there in the background. Some of them, as you can see, looking apprehensive, and others, one or two, in fact, looking pretty chuffed with themselves. It was these very heavy mechanized personnel carriers that actually swung the fight in favor of the Argentines, because when Rex Hunt at Government House was warned that they were approaching, and these are American-built Amtraks that propelled themselves ashore from the Argentine ships at York Bay, when he heard they were approaching, he pretty much knew the game was up. And you can see that they have heavy machine guns mounted, and of course they were carrying troops in the back. But I think if one of these appeared at the back door or the front door of Government House and decided to go in, nothing was going to stop it. So at that point, he pretty much realized the game was up. And they came grinding up Ross Road, heading for Government House. And I'd never seen anything like it. I always think that this is a little bit like the H.G. Wells story, War of the Worlds, and when the people of the south of England saw these remarkable, terrifying machines emerging from somewhere, and they knew not where. But it wasn't good news then, and it wasn't good news for us. Within the space of an hour and a half, Stanley Airport had been secured, and the Argentine Air Force began flying in. There had been efforts to render the airport unusable, but the Marines didn't have enough explosives to mine the runway and blow it up, and instead they put Public Works Department earth-moving trucks and a few bulldozers in the middle of the strip. But the Argentines who arrived at York Bay were quickly able to remove all of those vehicles, albeit without the keys. I just guess they just pushed them off. And so this was a slightly bizarre thing. I decided early on that I would take as many photographs as I could. And on that morning, I actually got into my Jeep and drove down the airport road to see how far I could get before I was stopped. I didn't get very far, but I was carrying my cameras. And at that point, the Argentines were so jubilant and felt that they had a fait accompli and nothing was going to change. And they weren't concerned about young civilians carrying cameras. So I snapped this photograph of an Argentine Air Force F-28 arriving. And the odd thing was that only a matter of months before that, I'd been flying in one of these airplanes, the same one, when they were just providing a perfectly innocent passenger service to and from the islands. The next aerial visitors to arrive were the Pucará ground attack aircraft. These were small turboprop powered airplanes made in Argentina, and they didn't rely on lengthy runways, so they could be based at Stanley, and they could even be based at Pebble Island and Goose Green, but they did pack a punch. They had cannon and rocket launchers under the wings. So we would see them flying over Stanley, practicing, showing off, and on some occasions avoiding Harriers. On this occasion, there was a Harrier directly above, flying probably at about 3,000 or 4,000 feet. And the Pucará pilot knew he was no match for a Harrier, and he continued circling Stanley at a very low height until the Harrier had gone and he was safe to land. Almost immediately, the Argentines began flying their flags, and this one is flying on the flagpole at the Falkland Islands Defence Force headquarters on John Street, and you can see the town hall and actually the post office building just beyond. And I've taken this from my bedroom window at Rowan House. I during the early part of the occupation, as I mentioned, the Argentines simply didn't care. They just felt totally confident, and they believed nothing was going to remove them. So I could go out, take photographs as I wanted, and nobody was particularly concerned. But as time went on, as a couple of weeks went by, it became clear that that was not a wise thing to be doing. So more and more, I took photographs covertly, certainly not in the sense of spying, but trying to make sure that I wasn't going to get myself in deep trouble because I was by being arrested for carrying cameras. But it was quite difficult, therefore, to actually photograph Argentine individuals. But I managed to grab this photograph of two Argentine conscripts, again on the front road, and taken from the Upland Goose Hotel. And it's one of my favorites, actually. I mean, the guys look so young, and you really wonder about the wickedness of the people who had sent them there. I can't remember exactly what date, but about 3 weeks in, it started to become clear that this situation was going to become a great deal worse. So Pete King and I, my friend with whom I shared the darkroom, decided to lend a hand painting red crosses and creating blackouts at the King Edward Memorial Hospital. And so wherever I went, pretty much, I took my camera, and this one was snapped out of one of the windows of the hospital and shows the Argentines patrolling the streets in their panhard armored cars. They packed quite a punch, a surprisingly large gun in the turret of a small vehicle. They weren't particularly well suited to the Falklands. They were too heavy to go over the camp, but they became pretty much static artillery pieces in the last days. No vehicle belonging to a civilian was safe. We lost both of ours. The Argentines would turn up at one's door with a piece of paper liberally rubber stamped, which effectively said, "We're taking your car or your Land Rover, and here's a receipt, which isn't really worth the paper it's written on, but we're taking your car anyway, so give us the keys." One or two people had the foresight to disable their vehicles before they could be taken. Another young guy got himself in severe trouble by saying, "Yes, you can have the Land Rover, but you're not having the distributor." And he ripped the cables out, which ran from the distributor to the spark plugs. So he found himself in very serious trouble and was only saved from something probably very nasty by the intervention of Vice-Commodore Bluma-Reeve, who was an interesting character to emerge from the conflict and whose story you can read in my book. I was only in Stanley, of course. I would have, in a way, liked to have got out of the town, perhaps for two reasons. I thought it would probably be safer to get out of town, but I also felt that maybe I might be able to do something rather than being condemned to stay indoors or explore the town at my peril and put up with the Argentine occupation. But my parents had left the islands actually only a few days before the invasion. And I remember saying to my father at Stanley Airport, where I dropped him off, I said, "Now, Dad, things are not looking very good here. So if anything happens, in inverted commas, and we both knew what we were talking about, then I hope you're going to carry on to the UK." They were off for a holiday in Uruguay, Montevideo, where they'd spent many, many happy times. And Dad said, "Well, yes, of course, yeah, we wouldn't dream of coming back. We'll carry on, but I think it'll probably be all right." Well, it wasn't. While they were away, the invasion occurred. And I remember thinking, well, thank God, at least I don't have my parents to worry about. And about 4 days later, there was a knock on the door of Rowan House, and there were my mother and father. And they decided to come back, and they'd managed to get a flight on an Argentine Air Force aeroplane To this day, I have absolutely no idea how they did that, but they could be fairly persuasive. And so I was furious, and it took me a very, very long time to forgive them. And they were very contrite about it, but they said, no, we had to come back. And so we spent the entire war after that at the Upland Goose Hotel, which was a great vantage point. And that's where I took this photograph of the Argentine troops retreating on the 14th of June. And at this point, there was a complete rout of troops. The British had just taken the horseshoe of mountains to the west, stretching from Wireless Ridge around to Sapper Hill, pretty much. And the Argentines had nowhere to go but through Stanley. But this, we feared, was probably one of the most dangerous points in the conflict, because we didn't know how these demoralized, heavily armed young men were going to behave. At this point, though, I felt I could emerge again and start taking pictures because I thought, well, they're on the verge of formal surrender, and sort of what can they do, as it were. But it felt bad and felt, as I say, rather more dangerous, in fact, than it had for a very long time. And I remember stepping out in front of this group of Argentines who were moving back to other positions, and the NCO, who's looking right at me in the middle of the road, unleashed a mouthful of abuse at me, and then shouted to his men to march properly, stand tall, put their chins up, and be proud. And I must admit, at the time, I felt sympathetic to them. I thought this is something probably they had never asked for and didn't know that they were going to get themselves into. And they probably all had friends and colleagues whom they'd left in the mountains and would not be going home. On that morning, on the 14th, there was a strange sort of truce for about 6 hours. Nothing really happened, but it was tense. But I had my cameras at that point, and I thought that it would be good to try and reach the point where the British were. So I was with a friend, another Peter Roberts, and we agreed that we would walk up towards the west beyond Government House. If you know Stanley, you'll know there's a space of about probably, I'm not sure, about 500 yards between the Upland Goose and the 1914 Battle Memorial. And we could see that the British had stopped there and that there was nothing much happening in between. So we walked through the Argentines and then through this sort of no man's land in front of Government House, the Secretariat and Government House, up to the 1914 Battle Memorial, where we met these guys from 3 Para, and they had just arrived in town. This was one of the photographs, actually, that I mentioned earlier on that I had not processed properly, and it took the amazing skills of Alex Schneiderman to bring out and actually make a print from. So this is the first time I saw it in 40 years. And they were sitting on, these guys were sitting on a Scorpion tank, cleaning a captured Argentine rifle, and not far away were the bodies of several Argentines who'd been clearly caught in the shelling, which by this time had stopped, but for the preceding 24 hours or so had been extraordinarily heavy. And I'm quite sure that this unfortunate fellow had been killed in that shelling. Unfortunately for me, and to give him some kind of dignity, he'd been covered up. The period of 12 hours or so which followed that were extremely difficult because Stanley, which is the size of Ambridge or something like that, if you listen to the archers, was suddenly swamped with, in the region of 15,000 Argentines, and about 10, not that many Brits had yet arrived, but let's say 3,000 or 4,000 British soldiers had also arrived. The Argentines had surrendered formally, but were still out of control. And they, that night, the night of the 14th, 15th, they ran amok through much of Stanley, destroying property, destroying buildings, and we may never know, but it was always said that they were looking for their own officers to extract some degree of revenge for their mismanagement of the whole situation. This is looking down Philmore Hill towards the public jetty, and on the left is the old Globe store, which was one of our main shops for food, and that had been burned out completely, and you can see the debris on the road. A couple of British soldiers there carrying weapons, and the Argentines by this time unarmed. I can, if I think about it, looking at this photograph, I can still smell that area. The stench was horrible. The pressure then came on to do something humane with the prisoners. What do you do with 14 or 15,000 Argentine soldiers who have no shelter, no food, no military infrastructure to keep them alive? So the decision was made to get them onto the ferries and other ships that have been taken up from the trade to bring the British troops in as quickly as possible. So this was an operation which ran for the next 24, 36 hours through the night. And here you can see Argentine prisoners of war being on the public jetty, and they're being floodlit from the Forest, the little government ship which had been taken over by the Argentines, and they're boarding launches to take them out to, I think, probably the Norland and other ferries. This was the remains of the police station, which had been hit just a matter of 10 days or so, I think, before the surrender. I was emerging from my bunk on the floor of the lounge of the Upland Goose that morning when I heard the sound of a helicopter. I rushed to the front door. As I got there, I saw people on the road leaping into the ditch, literally, and I sort of stood transfixed as this helicopter had fired a missile, 2 missiles, in fact, pardon me, at the police station. One of the missiles, they were wire guided, and one of them seemed to lose control and went up into the sky and exploded. The other one carried on, apparently coming straight at us, but hit the police station, which was about, I don't know, 100, 150 meters to the west. And this was actually quite a pleasure in a way to me, because about 10 days, 2 weeks before that, I'd been arrested, and you guessed it, for taking photographs. And I'd been interrogated by their military police and intelligence cell in the police station. And so it was personal for me. I quite liked seeing the police station hit and put out of business. And I believe the one of the NCOs had been a bit unpleasant, was wounded in this. So this, for me, was one of the iconic scenes, really, of Stanley after the surrender. It was just wreckage and smoke and dirt and stench, and the Panhard armored cars, which had once been put to good use, were now abandoned, and tires flat here, and nothing. They weren't going anywhere anymore. It took a couple of days, actually, before the British troops, or all of them, were able to march into Stanley. And these were men of the Royal Marines. Another photograph, by the way, which was developed from an almost non-existent negative, which I saw for the first time in 40 years. And these guys had come in directly from the mountains, and they looked cold, they looked dirty, and they were probably absolutely exhausted. But this was as they came in from the mountains. Slightly more comfortable looking was this parade of parachute regiment soldiers who were heading for the church for a service of remembrance for all of their colleagues who died on Mount Longdon and at Goose Green. This was taken at the top of Wang's Hill. The Union flag, somebody must have kept one in one of these houses, and they put it up the pole over the remains of this burning building. But sort of rather symbolic photograph. I remember speaking to Alex Schneiderman, who was processing and restoring the photos, and I said, you'll want to get that image of me with my camera in the wing mirror of my Jeep out of the way. And he said, no, you must keep that. That shows authenticity. We all do that these days. So it stayed in. The pressure on islanders at that point was to repair their buildings. And this is a chap called McPhee, Pat McPhee. His nickname was Pluto for some reason, but anyway, he was repairing his house, which he'd been abandoned, and you can see all the shrapnel and bullet holes. This would have been on Davis Street to the south side of Stanley. Among the detritus were vast heaps of weaponry, and ultimately all of these weapons were just dumped in the sea. But for a space of a week or so, nobody was looking after them, and that is me, actually. Some friends and I went to explore, and one could pick up a weapon and walk off with it if one wanted to, anything from a bazooka to a pistol. In fact, I think I probably did take that one away, but certainly didn't keep it for very long. But among the heap of weapons, you would see images like this. The Argentine conscripts had clearly placed their faith in the Lord. Whether that had helped them or not, I don't know. But actually, I suspect something helped this guy, because he would not have been able to surrender his weapon. And for it to end up in that heap that I just showed you, if he'd died. So so perhaps the image of the Virgin helped him after all. After the surrender, I was able to get out of town more, and I went to Goose Green, where the wreckage of the Rio Caracania, I think it's pronounced, was high and dry up on the beach, ready for everybody to see. And she was a coastal patrol boat, which spent much of her time in Stanley Harbour during the occupation. And at night, she would patrol Stanley Harbour, illuminating the seafront with her searchlight, looking for special forces, which they were convinced had landed in Stanley. But she was hit by helicopters while trying to take artillery pieces up to Goose Green during the battle there. The Pucaras, which I showed you flying around earlier on, all met a bad fate. This one was destroyed on the ground at Stanley Airport during one of the many air attacks. People tend to think that Stanley Airport was just attacked by the huge Vulcan bomber on the 1st of May, I think it was. But in fact, there were air raids by Harriers. It seemed like every second day, Stanley Airport was attacked by Harriers, and there wasn't much left of it at the end. Rex Hunt had always said that he would be back, and he was as soon as possible. I can't remember the dates now, to be honest, but I think this would have been around about the end of June, when he arrived back in a Hercules C-130 of the RAF and was met by Sandy Woodward on the right, who was in overall command of the task force. My old colleague Patrick Watts there, trying to hear what's going on for local radio with his microphone. It wasn't long either, although Stanley was basically restored and Stanley Airport had been extended. So the situation had been vastly stabilized, but it wasn't too long before Mrs. Thatcher herself came to visit. And on this particular morning, I was phoned by the Army information officer. He said, "Can't tell you what, but get yourself to the airport at 10 a.m. Because we have an interesting story for you." So I went there, and the only other press who were there was a news team led by Nicholas Witchell. And he didn't know what was going on either, but there were a couple of other press people and stringers for press newspapers. But at that time I was writing for the Daily Mail, I was stringing for them. And so I had a scoop with the Daily Mail. Wouldn't buy the paper these days necessarily, but they were great to work for and good journalists, and they paid extraordinarily well. So I had a scoop on my hands and front page for the next couple of days, thanks to Mrs. Thatcher. Quite some time passed before it was thought that the islands and the military were ready to reinter the British dead at Blue Beach Military Cemetery. And that coincided with a visit by their next of kin. It was a very moving occasion, and it was extraordinarily well done. It's the sort of thing that we do well. But here you can see the casket containing H. Jones being prepared for reinterment at Blue Beach Cemetery. But of course, there were many people who, as they say, had no known grave but the sea. So I was able to join the next of kin and other people on board one of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary ships steaming out into the north of Falklands Sound, where a service of remembrance was held. And I may be wrong, but I believe the figure in the blue belt in the middle is de la Billière, who was, I think, leader of the SAS at that point and went on to be Commander British Forces Falklands. And I have to say that actually life did start to return to a degree of normality fairly soon. And the troops and the sailors still had a very serious job to do, because nobody knew that the conflict was really over. But it wasn't long before events, public events, were being marked with parades of this sort. John Knott, who was a controversial character, because it was his defense review, which decided that HMS Endurance should be withdrawn, and that was taken as something of a green light to the Argentines to invade, although that is simplifying it vastly. He was still defense secretary at the end of the war, and well after the end of the war, and he came down to see for himself what the islands were like. And I was able to join, as Penguin News editor, I was able to join his party as we traveled around the Falklands. The detritus and the battlefields took much longer to clear up. And for years afterwards, really, one could still wander around being careful, because there was still live ordnance to be found, exploring the Argentine defensive positions. This is a military policeman who was at the time, I believe, involved in checking dugouts to make sure that there were no unexploded grenades and so on. The Royal Engineers rapidly became quite heroic figures, actually, because they were the ones who had to do the highly dangerous business of clearing up, getting rid of the sort of weapons that you can see here, the mortar bombs, which are prepared for demolition, and disposing of weapons like this American-made, well, possibly not American-made, but American-designed submachine gun, which had been just left on the battlefield. So the work they did was tremendous, and not the most pleasant or safe work. And the troops, many of them, moved into Stanley and stayed there, because it was some time before accommodation, especially built accommodation such as the coastels, which were moored in Stanley, could be brought to the Falklands and set up. So the pubs would be doing a roaring trade. And here you can see a couple of them having a few beers, and why not, enjoying what the Falklands had to offer. This was at Pebble Island. I was commissioned to do a story for the Sunday Times magazine. They wanted me to do a profile of an islander, preferably a sheep farmer who had experienced the war. And I thought immediately of Griff Evans, who was the manager at Pebble Island at the time when the Argentines moved in, occupied it. And then he was also there when the SAS mounted their raid on the airbase, the Argentine airbase there. And here's Griff. Griff said, "Oh, do you want to see my airplane?" Because he felt that he deserved this after all the experiences he'd had. So this was an Argentine Turbomenta ground attack aircraft and trainer. but Griff said it tongue-in-cheek. He never expected to keep it, but it made a good backdrop for that little article in the Sunday Times. Cleaning up in Stanley, of course, went on for months. And this gentleman, Bill Clitheroe, we were talking earlier on about houses and properties sort of held together or not very well erected and so on. But I often thought that many houses in Stanley, the corrugated and iron buildings that they were pretty much held together with paint and not much else. And Bill Clitheroe's house was rather like that, and here he is. But he was always working on it, and pleased to be photographed. But I love his face, and there's a certain stoicism about him, and I like it. For months after the war, Stanley Harbour was actually said to be the busiest harbour in the South Atlantic. And beyond the wrecked Pukaras here at the west end of Stanley Airport, you can see the many ships that were taken up from the trade, RFA ship in the foreground, and ferries and freighters and a liner, all of these filling Stanley Airport. It had never before been seen, and it hasn't been seen since. So there we come to the end of my little presentation. I just thought I would include this photograph. This is Neil Watson, a chap who I knew very well. And at the time of the war in 1982, he went from his farm at Long Island to the front line at the Estancia, with many other islanders and farmers from the North Camp area of East Falkland. And he proceeded to carry ammunition, supplies, and troops from the rear area up to the front line, and even beyond the front line at times. And this photograph was actually taken much more recently than the others, around about 2002 I took it, so still quite some time ago. Neil sadly is no longer with us, but after my interview with him, he picked up this this old Argentine helmet that had seen better days, and he reminisced very emotionally, really, about those days when he had put his life on the line, really, to fight the Argentines and establish the freedom of his own islands. So thank you everybody very much. And I don't know if we have some questions. I hope I haven't gone on too